spoke from this morning, and that you're getting a chance to connect with each other as well, which is clearly happening. I've had a chance to talk to a number of people over lunch in terms of, I'm hearing a really big white noise all of a sudden. Sorry about the white noise, guys. About some of the things that they heard and some reactions to it. It was just very interesting. I think people really felt like some of the science fiction movies that we've all subsumed into our popular culture, especially Minority Report, which was that Tom Cruise movie from the 90s, that some of these things are actually coming to be now. And so it's just really important for us to understand that word cloud with the future word in it it's not future anymore, it's present. So for us to be thinking about this right now and asking critical questions and also thinking about the opportunities is really important. I met with one person who's been in the AI space for a number of years, working on Alexa and now currently in a startup, and he said that the next steps that he sees coming that we won't necessarily address today is twofold. One is that AI will be more into contextual analysis. So, I think AI will not just be responding to something that we put it in the middle of, that it actually will understand, what is the context of what's happening and how to start to continue learning off that. And then the other thing is, of course, whenever you build anything great, it's subject to attack. And so as people recognize that AI tools are becoming more and more prevalent, just like with the internet and social media, they will look to game the system essentially and attack it and make it respond differently. And we saw a couple of examples about that recently where there was a bot that people game to make racist on Twitter. So it's just out there because we have the opportunity to interact with it differently. Finally, before we move to Claudia to talk about values, I had a conversation with Vinay. Obviously, Shankar had a lot of opportunity to talk about the things that we should be really careful about and think about around technology. And, Vinay's focus has really been thinking about the human place in all of this, and I just wanted to give him a chance to say a couple of words about that. Vinay, are you nearby for a microphone anywhere? Or are you having, there he is, over there. Do you want to come up this way, because you spoke last time from the back and nobody saw you?
Yeah, actually, thanks for the opportunity. I don't know if it's a rebuttal or maybe more of a clarification.
Just watch it. We've learned to point the microphone.
So I think it's more of a clarification than really a rebuttal. So I think as we're kind of going through talking about AI and some of those use cases, I think a couple of things. One, a lot of the challenges that Shankar, which by the way I agree with, I think these are really real problems that we need to figure out how to solve. I don't know if they're AI problems though. And I think that's kind of, where my piece is. AI is a part of that. But look, if there's going to be a law enforcement agency that's going to hire a company that's going to help them to prove out their stat of arrests in a certain area, that's going to happen with or without AI. Those particular examples, however, are uses of just bad AI in general. In fact, potentially not even maybe even being AI. So when you look at how these technologies work, in the situation with a law enforcement agency, somebody was trying to prove, again, it wasn't the agency as a whole, it was somebody that made a decision, they had the power to make a decision, that chose a company that was going to fulfill their agenda. Because who makes these decisions is really important. If you were to do this properly using AI, the question would be, how can we improve our communities? And then we collectively as a group that know how to improve those communities would then look at a wide variety of data sets. And maybe the conclusion, if you properly use deep learning, machine learning, you would not just take in the two sets of data is demographic, location, and what to do to police them. You would look at how can I improve communities? And maybe the answer would not be law enforcement, but it might be public transportation. It might be other aid, right? That's what AI does. And that's when you use AI properly and ask the right questions, that's the level of data set. So you need robust data sets to be able to prove that. Now you may need to add other data sets like income, right? Which may not be great if you use it incorrectly, but it'll help to build out models for correlation. And when you're working with the right team, you're not going to say, go do this at this time. They'll give you options with a level of certainty around what you can do. But it starts with the questions we ask for the problems we're trying to solve for. The problem they were trying to solve for is more arrest in this area. That's the problem, not how do I help the community as a whole. So AI has the opportunity to do so. We want to kind of put the big five companies in a category as well. Look, at the end of the day, if the big five companies does something, you can sue them. They'll change. That's why sometimes working with those companies is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing because they also do a lot of things open source. those examples are usually done when it comes to bad uses of AI are small companies that you can't hold accountable, too small, right? So so there's so many things that happen there. But that's why this day is so important, because it wasn't an engineer that made that decision, right? As we kind of look at technology, how can technology work? It was a group of people trying to solve for something. So as we look at that, I think, again, I do want to emphasize, I do agree with Shankar in a lot of stuff. Technology can be used in ways that really hurt disenfranchised groups continuously. But I think we do have the power to use that technology to empower those groups as well.
Great, thanks very much. Vinay, do you want to applaud that by all means? and thus disappears my idea of making a lot of money off Narayan versus Narayan, the television show. But this is a great transition into Claudia, because what Vinay was talking about is it refers back to some required reading in our program a few years ago, a book called Geek Heresy by Kentaro Toyama, who said that technology should never be seen as the outright solution to anything, because all it does is amplify existing human forces. So if you've got a situation that's bad because people aren't behaving well, the technology is going to amplify that and make it worse. You could think about maybe YouTube comments or something like that. And the converse also, if things are great, if there's a really healthy community, technology can help make that better. And so as we were thinking about, creating a methodology around today, and it's very much something we've made up, this idea that you need to understand the technology, then you need to understand what your community or organization requires of the technology that aligns with who it is, leading to decisions you make. We realized, well, how do we actually figure out who we are as a technology? Do you just make that as an organization? Do we just make that up? And so we started to think, well, we have to bulk that section up a bit. So we had, obviously, Shankar talking about vulnerable communities and maybe law to a certain degree, but we want to get at the issue of values as well. Do we have to be a healthy human entity to be able to apply these technologies, which is why we came to Claudia Chang and say, hey, Claudia, you want to speak at our event? And Claudia is an awesome member of our faculty, and she teaches an incredible class around leadership and teams for us. And she said, yes, thank you, Claudia. Claudia also has her own consulting firm where she does a lot of global work around the idea of leadership and change management. So we feel really lucky to have her, and I think her talk will feed this idea that I shared with you in the manifesto at the outset of the day, where ideally we as communication leaders are supporting humans through the journey of being human, and maybe we need to unpack that, what it means to be human and what matters most to us from a values point of view. So with that, I give you Claudia Chang. Claudia.
Is this?
That's probably my fault.
Is that your fault?
Yeah.
It's like the unicorn competency to be able to speak into a microphone or to have everything working when you want it to. Okay. So, hopefully everybody's still around. What's nice and always interesting to me after being part of the after lunch session is you get a chance to see who's come back, okay? And it looks like there's still a critical mass of people, so thank you for that. All right, so could I see a show of hands? Where are the competitive people in the room? Get your hands up. That you're just it's on, all right? Great, thank you. Let's see the hands too of who are the people who love to make lists? There's something really satisfying, right? All right, good. So as you can see on the screen, if you've been reading that, you either already have a piece of paper in front of you as well as a pen, okay? No tablets, right? There's something around the neuroplasticity of using a piece of paper and pen. Because here's what you're going to do. I would like you, for the next 30 seconds, to turn to the person next to you, okay? And you have one task. You're going to spend 30 seconds brainstorming the biggest list you can of ideas, reactions, and thoughts to this question, okay? You don't have to understand it, you don't have to discuss it, you don't have to agree it. Say it, write it down. This is the question. What is organizational culture? Go. You've got 10 seconds left. Okay, you can stop. All right. So it's just an initial moment, okay? Hold on to that. We're going to come back to it in a very few minutes, all right? But what I'd like you to also do is to stay in that brain space of where you are right now, like organizational culture. Notice what's going on. Stay in that place, okay? Because when it comes to organizational culture, it's actually part of a larger piece, okay? So for me, growing up in a family with a mother from Berlin and a father from Beijing gave my brother and I a very dynamic context around behaviors and traditions and actions and facial expressions, right? A lot of it was above the waterline. We could see tone, conversation, body language. And a lot of it, almost more of it, was underwater. We couldn't see the values. We didn't see the assumptions. We didn't understand the expectations that drove how the world is organized and what those actions and behaviors would be or should be, right? So for example, respect is a cherished value in our family, okay? But what it looks like is very different across this people who became this group, okay? And as we started engaging in that culture, right? Because what is culture really at its most basic term? It is what happens when a group of people get together and start doing stuff, right? So whether it's a family, organization, or a community, right? Culture takes on a life of its own, and just like this image of the hippo, right? There's a lot above that you can see. There's a lot going on underneath. It's static. It's not static, it moves around, right? And is very affected by currents and ebbs and flows that happen outside that particular system. Now, when I was that little kid in that picture, I didn't have a word to it. Oh, okay, great, thank you. I was like, oh. We didn't have it. We didn't know it was culture, but that's what it was, right? So very loosely, on one level, culture gets broken into two main pillars. What I've mentioned, what you see above the water, what you can see visibly, and what you see underneath, okay? And as we grow up in the world, our individual culture and our individual set of values are shaped by these two pieces. They show how we show up in the world. Okay, and I mean, think about it, right? On a personal level, you use your values and beliefs about things to drive decisions all the time, right? From deciding what kind of coffee to buy to where you decide to work or how you organize your personal relationships. This is informed by your value set, and kind of if you were a one-person organizational culture, you use that to drive those decisions. Why do you do that? Why do we do that? Okay? Because there's something about the syncing up of how we are internally and matching it up with how we are externally that offers the largest pathway for focus, for feeling fulfilled, for seeking the impact that we like. Okay? There's something about it that just feels in sync. All right? And so as we go through that world, we ask these kinds of questions. What are my values? What are the behaviors that are associated with it, right? And when assessing any kind of opportunity ahead of us, do I want to buy that coffee? Do I want to take that job? We screen it through this value system because it feels like it's a more productive place for us to be, okay? We see where it aligns, and we notice where it doesn't align, okay? Now, we all know that the 100% alignment aspiration can be really challenging, okay? But what's important about that is it offers up the chance by being explicit to register that and to think about what kind of choices we want to make because it's above the waterline, okay? So that's fine on the personal level, right? We can say, okay, I get that, right? But when we start talking about organizational culture, things can start to feel kind of slippery and it's a little difficult. We'll say, well, it feels like water, right? Like you pick it up and you think you've got it and then it's gone and then you don't know what happened. So what are some of the things that came up? in your discussion? What is organizational culture? Let's just hear one or two things. Hierarchy. What else? Mission. Okay. Anything else? Relationships? What's that? Structured. Okay. Empowerment. Okay. So these are all examples of organizational culture, things that come in to basically, it's how things are done at an organization or in a community, right? It's how we do stuff. It is the combination of those values, behaviors, and assumptions. Empowerment, hierarchy, right? Another way to think about it is organizational culture in some ways is a kind of Lonely Planet guide for what happens at work, right? Why do we buy Lonely Planet books when we're going traveling, right? Because it feels like, well, this is the way we can make sense of things. This is understanding how to navigate, right? Now, there's a lot to be said for traveling without a Lonely Planet book, so I want to acknowledge that, right? But this idea of like, well, I'm just going to take the day as it comes is not necessarily a business practice that I would recommend, okay? So we see that organizational culture allows us to really get to the heart of an organization. It takes what people think, what we do, and it gives us an explicit space to think about how to drive our decisions and how you are externally as an organization or a community through that culture, okay? So, but it's very tricky because we could say, well, all right, I get that intellectually, I'm on board, right? I know we need to work with organizational culture, but how do we do that? What are some things we can ask? So I would offer you these questions that draw from what you know at the individual level, right? So that when we're in leadership positions, when we're with teams, that we ask, what are our values? Okay? What is it that we hold close? What do we get behind as an organization? But more importantly, what are the behaviors that will reflect those values? What do we want to see ourselves doing that actually would help us recognize it, right? We've all seen respect as an organizational value, okay? But the challenge, I would say, is in how do you identify and surface those behaviors? What does it look like? What would respect look like? What does empowerment look like, right? We've heard a lot of discussion today around how to bring those kinds of values to reality and fruition, right? And by asking where it aligns and where it misaligns is not to automatically say that's a stop, that's a go, right? It might, right? When we were hearing from Shankar and others this morning, there's a lot of things that we need to be challenging with and tackling, okay? The value behind that identification and surfacing of alignment or misalignment rooted in values is that it gives us, I mean, no pun intended, right? It gives a kind of data point for what's at stake. Because as we're discussing and we're hearing more of this morning, the potential implications for that and for not doing it have implications around issues of equity, around access, and I would say also earnings, right? Because this copy of Forbes magazine, for those of you who haven't seen it, has a certain someone named Satya on it, leading an interview issue that talks about how principle and culture-focused organizations are increasingly among the top earning companies, all right? So if financial value is something you're prioritizing, okay, principles and cultures also have a core business case in that as well. So if social justice and being a better human is something that doesn't feel complete enough, you know, you can add the financial aspect onto it as well, okay? So a couple of things happen is that we've talked about you have improved alignment of people, product, and principles, right? You get more stuff done, right? You have stronger forecasting ability, influencing, and risk management ability. You're aware of what's on the surface, what's above the waterline, to try to figure out how you're going to deal with that. I don't like it, but we're going to live with it. Or I don't like it, and we're not living with that. Okay? You have that higher purpose and impact, whether it's financial, whether it's social, whether it's environmental. It allows you to track things just as our own individual culture and value system allows us to track our lives in a way that feels as productive and meaningful as possible. Okay? So just to summarize, organizational culture, I offer you to think of it as the head, heart, and hands of an organization. It is where everything lives. It is an enormous resource to mine out how you actually want to drive your company or organization or community. It's perfectly positioned, therefore, to be that guide for shaping how to develop that alignment. And lastly, using organizational culture in this way maximizes your chances, I would argue, for the highest return, both on purpose and profits or impact are your main indicators of success. So as you move into your afternoon activity, I'm going to leave you with this call to action, which is, what is your Lonely Planet workplace going to say about emerging tech and your AI activity today? What is it that you want it to say? Because if you look at the interface between the culture hippo and something like artificial intelligence, decide what kind of relationship you want to have between these two items. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claudia. If I keep it on, because I can ask you a question. So if I were a CEO who came to you as a client and said, okay, I'm either an AI company or I'm about to apply AI, how do I what do I need to do to make this decision, to align whatever values I have or organization has with the decision we're going to make about this AI? Is there an initial question we should be answering on that?
The very first question I would ask you, if we were starting to this, I would ask you, Hanson, I would say, who is in that conversation? Who in the organization are you talking to? Because if it's, we have that internal bias that we like people who are like us, we hire the people who are kind of similar to us. So my first question to you would be, okay, who's going to be part of that conversation? Because as wide a range of voices and perspectives would be something I would want to understand first about that.
And would that require us to have a values set around diversity to even have that, or is that just necessary just to get the right kinds of answers to the question itself?
Yeah, it depends if you're saying, look, we're a new company, we actually don't even have any articulated values, right? So then you say, well, who should be part of that conversation versus, hey, we've gone through some group where we want to revise it. I would say, then let's work with what you've got. So you start with where you are. And it doesn't matter, I think, if you have articulated values or not, because we've all been in that conversation in organizations where you see values on the kitchen break room, and you're like, that has nothing to do with how this organization really works out.
So how do you actually figure out what your values are if you don't have a stated web page like a big company might have, like these are our values? How do you know that?
How do you know?
How do you know what your values are as a company?
The way I would start doing it is saying, well, what matters here to people? And you ask people, then that goes back to the kind of I would ask about the engagement platform.
So it's important to have a good diversity of stakeholders to be able to have that conversation, as you said it. From
Ideally.
Okay, great.
Ideally.
I know that we have somebody in the audience who actually had a question around values. Is John gone somewhere? John, do you want to, let me just throw this microphone at you.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about this through most of the day. One of the questions I have is how hard-coded, and let's speak in AI speak, how hard-coded do we want our 2019 values to be reflected in our AI strategies, given that values evolve? Mm-hmm. So, basically, how much do we want to make sure is, constitutional level, and then how much do we give room for flexibility?
It's an interesting question because if we're creating the AI now based on a certain set of assumptions and the AI keeps learning and growing based on that, are we hard coding stuff that may not be relevant or useful 5-10 years from now because the AI has gone in a different direction?
My initial reaction to that question right now, if you would ask me that in a kind of client perspective, is I would say actually the values in themselves are going to have less not criticalness, but actually it's going to be the behaviors that reflect that, all right? So that I would say, look, if you can get around a value like respect or something that's particularly common in this conversation, just that I've heard a lot this morning, is a value like transparency, okay? Because that is going to change as technology changes, right? But just as technology changes hardcore, so do words, right? Truth, what used to be considered true, is no longer considered true, right? So what I would offer there is that you start with what resonates the most comfortably, okay? But then actually spend more time on getting behind, well, what are the core behaviors that we think are going to reflect that, right? Because that is where I find in the work that I do has the most richness to actually mitigate and understand how an organizational culture lives and breathes. When I work with clients or companies, they very rarely will say things like, well, we have a problem with our value respect, right? They'll say, we have managers or teams that are fighting and they don't get along, right? So it actually gets right into the behavior piece. So that's why I think, for me, what's premium is matching the behavior language with the is matching the value language with the behavioral articulation. Because a lot of teams will stop at the behavior statement, at the value statement. And they kind of forget about the behavior, right?
That's a really important takeaway, because as we lead into the next activity, and Claudia alluded to this idea of making a decision around stop or go, that's something you have to think about. Before I hand it over to Molly, I just want to see if anybody else has any clarification questions from Claudia. And obviously, Claudia can help consult with you on the exercise moving forward. But anybody else have a question about organizational culture or thinking about behavior? Or because this is really an important thing as we're making decisions around these technologies. Okay, well, I think we're going to hold on to you. Oh, we have something. Oh. Good, you got it. Right, you definitely hold the mic.
Yeah, I'll keep talking. I want to re-ask Hanson's first question, where he put himself as the CEO, and
is that a power move?
Total power move. And ask it in terms of how does somebody at a lower level, like a project manager or an independent contributor, work within that organizational structure and those values, and how do they best approach acting in the name of the company's values if maybe they don't agree with it or they don't understand it?
In terms of how do you navigate sort of a larger culture, right? I think, particularly for this program, right, communication leadership, right? One of the things that we emphasize in the classes that I work with is that leadership is not only for people who have technically a leader title in their name, right? So how do you work with your team? You can have that conversation with your teams to be like, okay, well, what is important to us? What are the ways that we want to engage with each other, right? And I want to be very clear, and I appreciate your question, that prioritizing organizational culture and values and behaviors at any kind of a level at an organization is not only unicorns and daisies, and most of the times it's not, right? This is why it's so tricky, and a lot of companies are really allergic to taking on and tackling it. They'll say things like, well, we know we have an issue with organizational culture, but we're just not really sure where to start, right? And it's easier just to kind of leave it at that. But if you look at this issue, there's increasingly compelling fiscal hardcore evidence that shows companies that do take on that challenge will also have higher financial and impact returns. So with regards to your question, what I would advise is that, all right, where's your current sphere of influence that you can work with, and what can you do to build a subculture or affect that immediate zone of engagement to try to model those behaviors as much as you can.
And one more question over here, Claudia.
Over here. My question is, do you think organizational culture is best developed from a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach?
Okay. What I would offer you back is, does it need to be top or bottom? Yeah, I know, okay. See, because what I would say, my particular approach is that the more engaged it is across the layers of the organization, the higher your chances are for having the business traction and the results you want, right? So if you think about your own experience, if you're involved with something that you believe in and you can see yourself in, the chances are that we're actually going to show up for that more fully in terms of being more productive. We're going to probably be a nicer person to work with. Okay, so whether it's top down or bottom up, I would say is less important And what's more important is, all right, what is the way that's going to make sense in the context of this organization? So that is a question I would work with you on if you were, say, an organization, if you were heading up a startup, okay? I don't think there's a binary either or answer to this.
Great. Well,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you.
So much, Claudia. Let's give her another round of applause. All right, so I'm back, which means we're either going to eat something or do an activity. It seems to be kind of the theme here. Let's see here. So in thinking about what we heard from Claudia, Shankar, and Teresa today, we're now going to move on to this idea of how will AI impact communities. So thinking back to that activity that you started at the beginning of the day, we're going to discuss now at your tables how will AI impact different communities, the AI at the airport impact different communities. So you'll see here you have table numbers at your table. Each of you have been assigned a different persona who would be interacting at the airport in some way. So you have a rideshare driver, so an Uber or Lyft driver, a traveler, so someone who would actually be going to the airport to go on their trip, and then someone who would be driving their personal car to drop off that friend. So take a look, jot down what your table is. Give you a minute to do that, because you won't have the slide up in a sec. Okay. And so now at your table, let's take the next 10 minutes and consider these questions and the larger question of how would AI at the airport impact the specific community that you're going to be looking at today. So some things to consider. What other surveillance capabilities does this tech have, or does this science have, if we've been kind of talking about it in different ways? Who will get access to that data? Which communities might that impact? And what safeguards might mitigate that impact? So for example, what we heard from Shankar earlier today is the idea of police officers having access to that data. Would they have access to it? How might they use that data? Who would that impact? So take the next 10 minutes and discuss at your table, and then we'll reconvene.